Mr. Nunu.
The world didn't just learn who Spider-Man was, it turned on him. Everything unraveled in seconds. Right after exposing the truth, Quentin Beck made sure the entire planet knew the name behind the mask. And just like that, Peter Parker stopped being a friendly neighborhood hero and became public enemy number one. News vans swarmed the city. Cameras hunted him. Strangers argued about him on every corner. Even MJ got caught in the storm. Reporters surrounded her in the street, shoving microphones in her face, demanding answers. Peter had no choice but to swing in and pull her out before things spiraled further. He rushed her home the only way he could, through the skyline, but there was no escaping what waited inside. May already knew, and soon so did everyone else. Helicopters hovered outside their apartment. Commentators replayed edited footage that painted Mysterio as a fallen hero and Peter as his executioner. An arrest warrant followed. Investigations began. Ned, MJ, even May were dragged into questioning as suspected accomplices. The court of public opinion was far harsher than any judge. Their lawyer, Matt Murdock, managed to keep criminal charges from sticking. There wasn't enough evidence, but that didn't stop the hatred. Someone even hurled a brick through the window with a message praising Mysterio. Matt caught it midair without flinching. Peter noticed. He didn't comment, but he noticed. It became clear they couldn't stay. So Peter and May moved in with Happy, hoping the chaos would cool down. It didn't. At school, senior year felt like walking through a circus. Half the students wanted selfies, the other half wanted him expelled. Teachers stared at him differently. Privacy was gone, normal was gone. Only the rooftop felt safe, the one quiet corner where cameras couldn't follow. That's where Peter, MJ, and Ned talked about the future. MIT had always been the dream, a fresh start, a chance to build something beyond the mask. But when the acceptance letters arrived, that dream collapsed. They were rejected, not because they weren't qualified, but because of him. Guilt hit harder than any villain ever had. Peter couldn't fix public opinion. He couldn't rewind the press conference. But maybe he could erase it. So he went to the one man who bends reality like it's paper, Stephen Strange. Inside the sanctum, winter had somehow settled indoors. Wong warned him before Strange even agreed to listen. Peter asked for time travel. Strange refused. The timeline had already been fractured once to save billions. He wasn't risking it again for teenage drama, but Peter wasn't asking for himself. He was asking for MJ, for Ned, for May. Strange offered a different solution. A spell that would make the world forget Spider-Man's identity entirely. Dangerous? Absolutely. Permanent? Most likely. Peter agreed instantly. The spell began forming threads of glowing energy weaving through the air, but Peter couldn't help himself. He kept interrupting. Except MJ. Except Ned. Except May. Each adjustment destabilized the incantation. The magic twisted, splintered, and Strange barely contained a catastrophe. The spell was sealed away before it could tear reality apart, but the damage had already begun. That same afternoon, Peter tracked down the MIT administrator to plead for reconsideration. He never got the chance to finish his sentence. Traffic froze, people fled their cars, and from beneath the pavement, metal arms erupted. Dr. Octopus. The man recognized Peter. Peter didn't recognize him, not this version. They clashed across a highway, steel against webbing. Peter's nanotech suit fused with the mechanical arms, allowing him to override them mid-battle. When the villain unmasked him, confusion spread across his face. This wasn't the Peter Parker he knew. Before answers could surface, another figure attacked, a cackling silhouette riding a glider. Green Goblin. Strange intervened, pulling them into the Sanctum's underground containment chamber. That's when the truth hit. The failed spell hadn't erased memories. It had opened doors. Across the multiverse, anyone who knew Peter Parker was Spider-Man was being dragged into this world. Some were confused, some were furious. And most of them were destined to die fighting Spider-Man in their own universes. Strange intended to send them back immediately. Peter hesitated. If sending them home meant sending them to their deaths, wasn't that wrong? Strange handed him a device to capture the remaining arrivals while he prepared the reversal spell. Peter agreed, but doubt followed him. He found one of the newcomers draining power from electrical grids, a living storm calling himself Electro. Another figure emerged from swirling sand, Flint Marko, the Sandman. They spoke of battles Peter had never fought, deaths he never caused. Each one insisted they had been pulled away moments before dying. And suddenly Peter's mission didn't feel like containment. It felt like execution. When Norman Osborn appeared at May's shelter, disoriented, frightened, claiming he wasn't in control of the monster inside him, May saw a lost man. Peter saw a threat, but May's voice cut through his fear. If you can help someone, you do it. Back in the Sanctum's prison chamber, the villains realized what awaited them. Return meant death. Strange insisted destiny couldn't be rewritten. Peter disagreed, so he did the unthinkable. He stole the spell. What followed was less a fight and more a battle of wills across shifting dimensions. Strange separated Peter's spirit from his body, twisted reality around him, trapped him in mirrored landscapes. But Peter used something simpler than magic, geometry, to outmaneuver the Sorcerer Supreme and trap him instead. He wasn't running from responsibility. He was redefining it. Peter brought the villains to Happy's apartment. Using Stark tech and their own scientific knowledge, he began designing cures, not weapons. He repaired Otto's neural inhibitor, restoring his mind. He developed a device to drain Electro's unstable energy. He built a serum meant to suppress the Goblin persona. For a moment, it worked, until Norman smiled. Peter's spider sense screamed too late. The Goblin persona surged back, shattering the fragile alliance. Electro tore free. The lab exploded into chaos. Reporters captured everything. Helicopters circled overhead, and in the middle of the destruction, May stood her ground. She injected Norman with the serum they created, but the Goblin fought through it. Bombs detonated. The building collapsed. When the smoke cleared, May was still standing. For a second, Peter believed they'd survived. Then she staggered. The wound was fatal. As sirens wailed and police closed in, May used her last strength to tell Peter something he would carry forever. That power isn't a gift for comfort. It's a duty. And then she was gone. Grief hollowed him out. He disappeared. MJ and Ned waited, terrified. With Strange still trapped, Ned experimented with the sling ring and accidentally opened a portal. A Spider-Man stepped through, but not theirs, then another. Two different Peter Parkers from two different worlds, each scarred by loss, each having faced their own Green Goblin, each knowing what it meant to fail someone they loved. Together, they found Peter. He wanted revenge. He wanted blood. They offered understanding instead. They'd both lost someone because they hesitated, or because they didn't. Rage didn't heal anything. It only spreads. So the three Spider-Men made a plan, not to kill, to cure. They lured the remaining villains to the Statue of Liberty, now under renovation, a fitting battleground for a fractured reality. Electro arrived first, supercharged by stolen technology. Sandman followed. The Lizard lunged for the spell box. The trio fought as one, coordinated, instinctive, learning each other mid-battle. Sandman was restored. Electro was drained of power. The Lizard reverted. Otto returned to help, proving redemption was possible. Then the goblin arrived. He sabotaged the spell box. The explosion cracked open the sky itself. Across the horizon, silhouettes of countless beings pressed against tearing reality, all drawn by the same knowledge. Spider-Man's identity. As universes bled together, Peter confronted Norman one final time. He had every reason to kill him. He nearly did. But another Peter, the one who once lost Gwen, stopped him. Pain doesn't justify becoming the thing you hate. So instead of delivering a fatal blow, Peter chose mercy. He cured him. With the multiverse collapsing, Strange returned. There was only one solution left. To seal the fractures, everyone would need to forget Peter Parker entirely, not just the secret. The person, no memories, no friendships, no love, a clean erase. Peter agreed. He said goodbye to the other Spider-Men first, brothers forged in battle, then to MJ and Ned. He promised he'd find them again. The spell surged, and just like that, he was alone. Weeks later, snow dusted the city. Peter rehearsed introductions in his head before walking into MJ's coffee shop. She didn't recognize him. Neither did Ned. They'd been accepted into MIT. They were happy. He saw the bandage still wrapped around MJ's forehead, a reminder of the life they no longer remembered. He could have told them everything. He didn't. Instead, he let them keep their peace. Peter moved into a tiny apartment. No Avengers, no Stark tech, just a sewing machine and a new red and blue suit stitched by hand. The city still needed Spider-Man, even if it would never know Peter Parker again. Analysis: what if the worst thing that could ever happen to Spider-Man wasn't losing a fight, but losing himself? This isn't just another superhero sequel. This isn't just another Marvel blockbuster. Spider-Man: No Way Home is something much bigger. It's a story about identity exposed, a hero stripped of anonymity, a teenager forced to grow up instantly. For the first time in cinematic history, 3 generations of Spider-Man collide in one universe. Not as a gimmick, not as a cameo parade, but as a powerful exploration of legacy, regret, and responsibility. Because beneath the explosions, the multiverse chaos, and the crowd-cheering moments lies something deeply personal. This movie asks a terrifying question: what happens when the world knows who you are and decides it hates you for it? Peter Parker has always balanced 2 lives, the mask and the man. But when that balance shatters, everything he loves becomes collateral damage. His friends, his future, his family. And this time, there's no easy fix. What makes No Way Home stand out isn't just the scale, it's the consequences. Every decision matters, every mistake costs something, and every victory comes with sacrifice. This isn't the story of Spider-Man saving the world, it's the story of Peter Parker losing it. And by the end of this film, you don't just watch a superhero fight villains, you watch a boy become the Spider-Man we've always known. In this breakdown, we're diving deep into the story, the hidden meanings, the emotional weight, and why this film changed Spider-Man forever. Let's begin before we dive into the chaos of the multiverse. Let's set the stage. Released in 2021 and directed by John Watts, Spider-Man: No Way Home marks the 3rd solo outing for Tom Holland as Peter Parker within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But this isn't just Spider-Man 3. This is the direct fallout from Spider-Man: Far From Home, a film that ended with a bombshell. The entire world now knows that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. And that single revelation changes everything. Set in present-day New York City, the film blends superhero action with sci-fi multiverse elements and a surprisingly grounded coming-of-age drama. It's big, it's loud, it's visually explosive, but at its core it's deeply personal. The premise is simple and terrifying. Peter's secret identity has been exposed, his reputation is shattered, his loved ones are under constant scrutiny. With his future slipping away, he turns to Doctor Strange for help. The solution: a spell that will make the world forget that Peter Parker is Spider-Man. But when that spell goes wrong, reality itself begins to fracture. And suddenly, Peter's problem isn't just public opinion, it's the multiverse. What makes this setup so powerful is that it doesn't begin with a world-ending alien invasion or a cosmic war. It begins with something human. A teenager who just wants his life back. And from that emotional starting point, the story escalates into one of the most ambitious crossovers in superhero history. No spoilers yet, but understand this. This film isn't just about fixing a mistake, it's about facing the consequences of one. On the surface, Spider-Man: No Way Home looks like a full-blown multiverse spectacle, portals opening, villains colliding, timelines unraveling. But strip away the CGI, and what you're left with is something far more powerful. This is not just a superhero movie, it's a story about identity. For the first time, Peter Parker can't hide behind the mask. The world knows who he is, and when your identity is exposed, you don't just lose privacy, you lose control. The film constantly asks, who is Peter without the secret, and who is Spider-Man without the responsibility? And that leads us to the film's central theme: consequences. Every Spider-Man story has echoed the phrase, with great power comes great responsibility, but No Way Home pushes it further. It asks, what happens when responsibility demands something irreversible, when doing the right thing costs you everything? Then comes redemption. The villains in this story aren't just evil for the sake of it. They're broken, corrupted, misguided. And Peter chooses to see them not as enemies to defeat, but as people to save. That choice defines the emotional core of the movie. It's not about destroying your enemies, it's about healing them, but redemption isn't easy. And it isn't free. Tonally, the film shifts dramatically. It begins with the fast-paced energy and humor we expect from a Spider-Man adventure, but as the stakes rise, the tone matures. The jokes become quieter, the losses become heavier. The film grows up just like Peter does. Genre-wise, it's a blend of superhero action, sci-fi multiverse chaos, and coming-of-age drama, but emotionally, it feels like a tragedy disguised as a blockbuster. This isn't just about saving New York. It's about growing up. It's about sacrifice. And it's about becoming the hero not because you want to, but because you have to. That's what makes No Way Home more than spectacle. It makes it personal. The story begins not with triumph, but with exposure. The world now knows that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, accused of murder, hunted by the media, surrounded by chaos. What was once a double life carefully balanced between school and heroics is now completely shattered. Peter isn't just dealing with internet backlash, he's watching the people he loves suffer because of him. MJ, Ned, Aunt May. Their futures are suddenly compromised, not because of something they did, but because they know him. And that guilt, it eats at him. Desperate to fix things, Peter turns to Doctor Strange. The plan is simple. Cast a spell that makes the entire world forget that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, but Peter hesitates. He wants certain people to remember. MJ, Ned, Aunt May, and with every interruption the spell destabilizes. Reality fractures. The multiverse cracks open, and suddenly, villains from other universes begin appearing in Peter's world, not randomly, but specifically those who knew Spider-Man's true identity. Dr. Octopus arrives first, then Green Goblin. Electro, Sandman, the Lizard, these aren't just villains. They're men pulled from moments just before their deaths in their own universes. Doctor Strange wants to send them back immediately, sealing their fate, but Peter refuses. Because he realizes something, if they go back, they die. So instead of fighting to defeat them, Peter chooses something far more dangerous. He chooses to save them. He believes they can be cured, that their powers and madness can be reversed, that they deserve a second chance. And for a moment, it almost works, until Green Goblin emerges, not Norman Osborn, but the darker persona within him, manipulative, cruel, calculating. And in one devastating confrontation, everything changes. Aunt May is killed, and with her final breath, she delivers the words that define Spider-Man's legacy. With great power, there must also come great responsibility. Peter is shattered. Consumed by grief, fueled by rage, he wants revenge, not justice. But before he can lose himself completely, something extraordinary happens. Two other Spider-Men arrive from other universes, one older, one carrying his own regrets. Together, the three Peters form an unlikely brotherhood. They share pain, they share loss, and they remind this Peter who he's supposed to be, not an Avenger, not a celebrity, a hero. They create cures for each villain, not to destroy them, but to heal them. And in the final battle at the Statue of Liberty, the multiverse threatens to tear open completely. Villains clash, portals open, the sky fractures. But in the middle of the chaos, Peter makes a choice, not fueled by anger, not driven by revenge, but guided by responsibility. And that choice will cost him more than anything he's ever lost. Because in the end, the greatest battle isn't against the villains, it's against himself. By the time we reach the final act of Spider-Man, No Way Home, this is no longer a story about fixing a mistake, it's about paying for it. The multiverse is collapsing, cracks tear across the sky, shadows of people from other realities begin pushing through, all of them drawn to one truth: they know Peter Parker is Spider-Man. Doctor Strange tries to contain it, but it's too late. The spell is broken beyond repair. Reality itself is unraveling. And that's when Peter understands something devastating. There's only one way to fix this. Not by making the world forget that he's Spider-Man, but by making the world forget Peter Parker. Completely, no one remembers him. No records, no relationships, no shared history. MJ forgets, Ned forgets, Happy forgets. It's not just a memory wipe, it's erasure. Peter chooses it anyway, because this is the purest form of responsibility. No applause, no recognition, no gratitude, just sacrifice. The spell is cast, the fractures seal. The multiverse closes, and Peter Parker becomes a stranger to the world. Now let's talk about what this really means. On the surface, it's a reset, a clean slate, a way to bring Spider-Man back to his classic roots, struggling alone in a small apartment, sewing his own suit, listening to police scanners instead of Avengers briefings. But symbolically, it's Peter's true origin story. Up until now, he's had mentors, Stark technology, friends who knew his secret, a support system. Now, he has none of it. He finally becomes the Spider-Man defined by sacrifice and anonymity. There's also a heartbreaking moment near the end that says everything. Peter visits MJ at the coffee shop where she works. He plans to tell her the truth, to rebuild what they had. But when he sees the small bandage on her forehead, a reminder of the danger she endured because of him, he stops. He realizes loving her means risking her life again. So he walks away, not because he doesn't care, but because he does. That's the emotional core of this ending. It's not about loneliness, it's about protection through absence. And in the final scene, as Peter swings through snowy New York in his new red and blue suit, handmade, classic, stripped of high-tech upgrades, we see something powerful. He's alone, but he's at peace. Because for the first time, Peter Parker didn't choose what was easy. He chose what was right, and that's what truly makes him Spider-Man. Now here's where Spider-Man: No Way Home becomes even more impressive. Because beyond the big fights, beyond the emotional reunions, this film is layered with subtle details, visual metaphors, and callbacks that many viewers completely missed. Let's break them down. When the final suit of visual rebirth at the very end of the film, Peter debuts a brand new red and blue suit. No nanotech, no Stark upgrades, no advanced AI, just fabric, handmade, classic. This isn't just a costume change, it's symbolic. Throughout the trilogy, Peter relied heavily on Tony Stark's technology, but after the memory wipe, he's stripped of every external support system. The new suit visually represents independence. It's a return to the comic book roots, the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man who builds everything himself. This is Peter starting over. To Aunt May's line, "A shift in legacy for decades," the iconic phrase, "with great power comes great responsibility," was tied to Uncle Ben. But here, Aunt May delivers it. That change matters. It reframes this version of Spider-Man's origin. Instead of repeating the same backstory we've seen before, the film redefines the emotional trigger. May's death becomes the defining trauma that shapes this Peter into the hero we recognize. It's not a retelling, it's a reinvention. 3. The mirror scene, Norman versus Goblin. There's a subtle but brilliant moment when Norman Osborn talks to his reflection. The mirror doesn't just reflect him, it represents the Green Goblin persona. Two voices, two identities. The distortion in the reflection visually symbolizes the psychological fracture within him. It's not just a villain's speech, it's a battle inside one mind. And that internal conflict mirrors Peter's own struggle between vengeance and responsibility. 4. Andrew Garfield's redemption. One of the most emotional callbacks in the film happens quietly. When the alternate Spider-Man saves MJ during the final battle, he breaks down. Why? Because in his universe he failed to save Gwen. This moment isn't fan service, it's emotional closure. It gives that version of Spider-Man redemption years after his own story ended. It's healing through the multiverse. 5. Foreshadowing. In the beginning, early in the film, Peter is obsessed with fixing things quickly. He interrupts Doctor Strange's spell. He rushes solutions. That impatience directly causes the multiverse crisis. It's subtle foreshadowing. Peter's biggest enemy isn't a villain, it's immaturity. By the end, he no longer interrupts fate, he accepts it. 6. The Statue of Liberty upgrade. The final battle takes place at the Statue of Liberty, under renovation to hold Captain America's shield. That visual isn't random. Captain America represents sacrifice for the greater good, and it's here, beneath that symbol, that Peter makes his ultimate sacrifice, giving up his identity to save the world. The setting reinforces the theme. What makes No Way Home so powerful isn't just what it shows on the surface. It's the quiet storytelling underneath. Every suit change, every reflection shot, every callback, they're not just references. They're emotional building blocks that turn a multiverse blockbuster into a character-defining masterpiece. And that's what separates spectacle from storytelling. Now let's step behind the mask, because the story of how Spider-Man No Way Home was made is almost as dramatic as the movie itself. This wasn't just a film production, it was a secrecy operation. One the biggest secret in Hollywood for over a year, rumors swirled about former Spider-Man actors returning. Leaked set photos, fan theories exploding online, but officially, nothing was confirmed. The studio went to extreme lengths to protect the surprise. Cast members dodged questions in interviews. Certain actors were reportedly filmed separately. Even fake script pages were used to prevent spoilers. When audiences finally saw the portals open in theaters, the reaction wasn't just excitement. It was cinematic history. 2. Willem Dafoe's condition to return. When Willem Dafoe agreed to return as Green Goblin, he had one major condition. He didn't want to just appear in dialogue-heavy scenes. he wanted to be physically involved. Despite being in his 60s during filming, Dafoe performed many of his own stunts, including intense fight sequences. That physical commitment is why his performance feels so raw and dangerous. The Goblin doesn't just talk chaos, he moves like it. 3 emotional improvisations between the Spider-Men, some of the most heartfelt moments between the 3 Spider-Men, weren't rigidly scripted. Reports suggest that certain bonding conversations were shaped collaboratively by the actors themselves. That's why their dynamic feels natural, less like a crossover event and more like 3 brothers sharing trauma. The chemistry wasn't manufactured, it was built. 4 pandemic production challenges filming took place during global COVID restrictions. Large crowd scenes were complicated, schedules shifted, visual effects teams had to adapt to remote workflows. And yet, despite those limitations, the film delivered one of the biggest-scale superhero spectacles ever made. In fact, the visual effects workload was so massive that some CGI sequences were refined extremely close to release. 5 multiple script versions, the story underwent several rewrites during development. Early ideas reportedly explored different multiverse angles, alternate villain combinations, and even different emotional endings. But the final version focused less on spectacle and more on Peter's sacrifice. And that creative decision is what grounded the film emotionally. 6, a box office phenomenon released at a time when theaters were still recovering, No Way Home defied expectations. It became one of the highest-grossing films of all time, proving that communal theatrical experiences still matter. Audiences didn't just watch it, they reacted to it, cheered, applauded, cried. It felt like an event. What makes these behind-the-scenes details so powerful is this: the film wasn't carried by nostalgia alone, it was carried by commitment. Actors committed to secrecy, performers committed to physicality, filmmakers committed to emotional storytelling. And when that level of effort aligns with a character as beloved as Spider-Man, you don't just get a movie, you get a moment in cinema history. To truly understand how big Spider-Man No Way Home is, we have to compare it, because this film doesn't just exist on its own. It stands on the shoulders of 2 decades of Spider-Man history. Spider compared to Spider-Man 2, 2004. When people talk about the greatest Spider-Man film ever made, one title always comes up: Spider-Man 2. That film focused heavily on Peter's personal struggle, the burden of responsibility, the cost of being a hero, and in many ways, No Way Home mirrors that emotional depth. But here's the difference. Spider-Man 2 told a personal story within one universe. No Way Home tells a personal story across multiple universes without losing emotional focus. It scales up the spectacle, but keeps the heart. Milky Way compared to Avengers Endgame. It's impossible not to compare this film to Avengers Endgame. Both are massive crossover events, both rely on nostalgia, both deliver crowd-cheering moments, but here's where they separate. Endgame was the conclusion of a saga. No Way Home is a transformation. Instead of wrapping up a long arc, it reshapes a character entirely. It strips Peter down and rebuilds him from scratch. One celebrates legacy, the other redefines it. The 3 Spider-Men a study in contrast. This is where the comparison becomes personal. Each Spider-Man represents a different stage of heroism. The older, experienced version, calm, reflective, carrying wisdom. The emotional, regret-filled version, still healing from past loss. And the youngest, impulsive, grieving, learning what responsibility truly costs. They're not competing. They're completing each other. Through them, the film compares different interpretations of the same character and shows that every version matters. Performing arts compared to other multiverse films in recent years, multiverse storytelling has become popular: alternate realities, variants, timelines. But what makes No Way Home different is its focus. It doesn't use the multiverse just for spectacle. It uses it for healing, for redemption, for closure. Instead of overwhelming the audience with complex timelines, it keeps the emotional stakes centered on one person. Peter Parker, what it does better, and where it struggles. What No Way Home does better than many superhero films is emotional payoff. The nostalgia isn't empty, it's tied to character growth. But it also leans heavily on audience knowledge. If you haven't seen earlier Spider-Man films, some moments won't hit as hard. Still, few movies have managed to balance fan service and character development this effectively. In the end, Spider-Man No Way Home isn't trying to replace previous Spider-Man films. It honors them, it connects them, and then it builds something new from their legacy. That's not just comparison, that's evolution. When Spider-Man No Way Home hit theaters in 2021, it didn't just release. It exploded. This wasn't just another Marvel premiere, it felt like a global event. Theaters were packed, tickets sold out in minutes. Social media went silent on spoilers but loud on reactions. And the box office numbers, nearly $2 billion worldwide. At a time when theaters were still recovering, this film became one of the highest-grossing movies in history. It proved something powerful: people will show up when the story matters. Movie camera audience reaction inside theaters, the reactions were electric: cheering, applause, even standing ovations. Certain moments triggered genuine emotional waves, not just excitement, but tears. For many fans, this wasn't just a movie. It was payoff, it was closure, it was childhood nostalgia meeting present-day storytelling. Audience scores soared across platforms, with many calling it the best Spider-Man film ever made. But was it really that good? Newspaper critics, response critics largely praised the film for its emotional weight and performances, especially the depth given to returning villains and the maturity of Peter's arc. Many noted that beneath the multiverse spectacle lies a surprisingly grounded and tragic story about loss and responsibility. However, some critics raised concerns. Does the film rely too heavily on nostalgia? Would it work as well without prior knowledge of earlier Spider-Man movies? Is the emotional impact amplified mainly because of legacy connections? And those questions sparked debate. Thinking face underrated, overrated, or justified. Some argue that the hype inflated expectations, that the crowd reactions created an emotional wave that made the film feel bigger than it actually was. Others believe the emotional storytelling earns every bit of its praise. Here's the truth. Nostalgia may open the door, but it doesn't sustain a story. What makes No Way Home resonate isn't just who appears on screen, it's what Peter loses, it's the sacrifice, it's the reset. It's watching a hero choose isolation over comfort. That's not fan service. That's character evolution. In the end, whether you see it as legendary or slightly overhyped, one thing is undeniable: Spider-Man. There are some movies you watch, and then there are movies you experience. Spider-Man: No Way Home is absolutely the second kind. This is the kind of film that reminds people why cinemas matter, why giant screens matter, why packed audiences matter, why shared reactions still matter. Because this isn't just a superhero movie playing in front of you. It feels like an event unfolding around you. The laughter, the gasps, the applause, the emotional silence, and the heavier moments, all of it becomes part of the experience. And that's what makes this film hit so hard. From a pure entertainment standpoint, No Way Home is operating at an incredibly high level. It's big, emotional, funny, fast-moving, visually explosive, and constantly giving the audience something to react to. It understands blockbuster rhythm. It knows when to go grand, when to slow down, when to land a joke, and when to let a dramatic beat breathe. So even at nearly 2.5 hours, it rarely feels like dead time. The movie moves with purpose, energy, and momentum. And what really makes that entertainment value stand out is how complete the experience feels. This isn't just action. It isn't just nostalgia. It isn't just spectacle. It's all of those things working together. The film gives you crowd-pleasing moments, huge visual payoffs, emotional swings, tension, heartbreak, fan excitement, and that constant feeling that something major could happen at any second. That balance is a huge part of why the movie works so well for so many people. It isn't relying on only one strength. It keeps feeding the audience different kinds of satisfaction. And honestly, that's one of the biggest reasons the film feels so rewatchable. Because even if you already know the major turns, the movie is built like an entertainment machine. It keeps pulling you forward. Scene after scene, reveal after reveal, emotional beat after emotional beat. It's designed to keep you locked in. It's not aiming to be quiet or restrained. It wants to thrill you, move you, and send you out feeling like you've been on a ride worth taking. That's why so many people didn't just like the movie, they felt the movie. For some viewers, this was the kind of theatrical experience they hadn't had in years, the kind where the audience energy becomes unforgettable, the kind where the film doesn't just play well, it erupts. And whether someone saw it as one of the best superhero films or simply a wildly effective blockbuster, the one thing that keeps coming up again and again is this: it delivers entertainment in the fullest cinematic sense. It's exciting, it's emotional, it's funny, it's huge. And most importantly, it feels like it knows exactly what audiences came for. Spider-Man: No Way Home doesn't just want to be watched, it wants to be felt. There's nostalgia, and then there's what Spider-Man: No Way Home does. Because this film doesn't just use nostalgia, it builds an entire cinematic experience around it. From the moment the story begins to unfold, you can feel it. This isn't just about one version of Spider-Man anymore. This is about all of them, every era, every interpretation. Every memory audiences have carried for years, and that's what makes it hit differently. This movie understands something very few franchise films truly get right. Nostalgia isn't just about reminding you of the past. It's about making that past matter again. It's about taking characters, moments, emotions that people grew up with, and giving them weight in the present. And here, it does exactly that. This isn't surface-level fan service. It's not just quick references or throwaway cameos designed to get applause. The film actually integrates legacy into the story itself. The past isn't decoration, it's part of the narrative engine. When earlier versions of Spider-Man and their worlds come into play, it doesn't feel like a gimmick. It feels like history colliding. You're not just watching characters return, you're watching time fold in on itself. You're watching different generations of storytelling finally acknowledge each other. And for fans who followed Spider-Man across decades, that creates something incredibly powerful. Because suddenly, those older films, those older moments, those emotional memories, they're not separate anymore. They're connected. And that connection is what transforms the experience. There are moments in this film where the audience reaction alone tells you everything. Not because something shocking happens, but because something familiar returns in a meaningful way. Something people didn't just watch, but grew up with. That's why the nostalgia works. It's not empty, it's not random, it's earned. The film shows clear reverence, not just for the character of Spider-Man, but for the filmmakers, performances, and stories that came before. You can feel that respect in the way scenes are written, in the way characters interact, in the way past arcs are revisited with new emotional context. It's like the movie is saying, everything that came before still matters. And that's rare, because most franchises reboot, replace, or ignore their past. This one embraces it. Now, does it lean heavily on nostalgia? Absolutely. And for some viewers, that can feel like a double-edged sword. There's always the question, is this celebration or reliance? But here's the key difference. Even when the film leans into nostalgia, it doesn't stop the story. It drives it forward. These moments aren't just there to make you smile. They shape the characters. They influence decisions. They create emotional payoffs that wouldn't exist without that history. And that's why, for so many people, this doesn't feel like nostalgia bait. It feels like a tribute to Spider-Man as a cinematic icon, a tribute to the fans who followed him across generations, and a tribute to the idea that stories don't just end, they evolve. By the time the film reaches its biggest moments, you're not just watching a superhero movie anymore. You're watching a celebration of legacy. And that's what makes No Way Home more than just another blockbuster. It turns memory into emotion. It turns history into storytelling. And it turns Spider-Man into something bigger than any single version of him. This isn't just a sequel. It's a love letter to everything Spider-Man has ever been. Everything begins with one moment, one truth, one mistake that can't be undone. Peter Parker is exposed. And just like that, the entire foundation of his life collapses. Because for most superheroes, identity is protection. It's the line that separates responsibility from normalcy. It's what allows them to save the world and still go home afterward. But here, that line is gone. And the film wastes no time showing you what that really means. This isn't fame. This isn't admiration. This isn't a hero being celebrated. This is pressure. This is chaos. This is a kid being dragged into a world he was never ready for. Suddenly, Peter isn't just Spider-Man anymore. He's a headline, a controversy, a target. The world is watching him, judging him, questioning him. And the fallout doesn't just hit him. It hits everyone around him. His friends, his family, his future. Opportunities disappear. Lives get disrupted. Every part of his personal world becomes collateral damage. And that's what gives the story its emotional weight right from the start. Because this isn't about saving the city. It's about fixing a life that's falling apart. Peter doesn't go looking for bigger battles. He doesn't chase some grand heroic mission. He's trying to undo the damage, trying to give his loved ones a normal life again, trying to erase a truth that never should have come out. And that motivation is what drives everything that follows. It's what leads him to Doctor Strange. It's what sets the entire plot in motion, and it's what ultimately opens the door to something far bigger than he ever imagined. The multiverse. But here's what's important. The multiverse isn't the real starting point of the story. This is a single emotional decision, a desperate attempt to make things right. Because Peter isn't acting out of arrogance, he's acting out of guilt, out of responsibility, out of love for the people whose lives he feels he's ruined. And that's where the tragedy begins. Because in trying to fix everything, he breaks something even bigger. The spell goes wrong. Reality fractures. And suddenly, the consequences of that one decision spiral completely out of control. And that's what makes this story foundation so effective. It's not built on some random threat. It's not built on a villain's master plan. It's built on Peter's choice. A choice that feels understandable. A choice that feels human. A choice that feels right in the moment, but carries consequences far beyond what he could ever predict. And that's the core of this film. Actions have consequences. Good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes, and sometimes, trying to fix a mistake only makes it worse. From that point on, everything in the story, the chaos, the danger, the emotional fallout, traces back to that single moment where Peter just wanted to make things better. And that's what gives the film its grounding. Because no matter how big the story becomes, no matter how wild the multiverse gets, it all started with something simple: a kid trying to fix his life and paying the price for it. This version of Peter Parker is different, not because he's stronger, not because he's smarter, but because he's exposed, emotionally, mentally, and morally. And No Way Home leans into that more than any Spider-Man film before it. From the very beginning, Peter isn't presented as a confident hero in control of his situation. He's overwhelmed, confused, trying to do the right thing without fully understanding the consequences of his actions. And that's where his vulnerability comes from. He's not broken, he's just not ready. Not ready for the weight of public judgment. Not ready for the damage his identity reveal causes. Not ready for the kind of decisions this story forces him to make. But what makes this characterization compelling is that the film doesn't treat those weaknesses as flaws to be corrected quickly. It builds the entire journey around them. Peter is emotional. He acts on instinct. He trusts easily. He believes people can be saved, even when everything around him suggests otherwise. And for some viewers, that's where frustration sets in. Because yes, he is naive. He makes choices that seem reckless. He prioritizes compassion over logic. He takes risks that don't make immediate sense in a world where the stakes are this high. But here's the key: that naivety is exactly what defines him. Because Peter Parker isn't supposed to be the most efficient hero. He's supposed to be the most human one. He doesn't see enemies the way others do. He sees people, broken people, people who made mistakes, people who might still have a chance, and that belief becomes the core of his moral instinct, even when it costs him, even when it puts him at odds with others, even when it leads to consequences he can't control. He still chooses to believe in redemption. That's not weakness, that's identity. And as the story progresses, that identity is tested harder than ever before. Because this isn't just about stopping villains, it's about deciding what kind of hero he wants to be. Does he follow the safer path, the logical path, the path that minimizes risk? Or does he stay true to himself, even if it hurts? And that's where the growth happens. Not in sudden transformation, not in one big heroic moment, but in the accumulation of consequences. Every mistake teaches him something. Every loss changes him. Every decision forces him to confront who he is becoming. And by the time the story reaches its emotional peak, you realize something important. This isn't the same Peter Parker anymore. The vulnerability is still there, but it's deeper now. The naivety is still there, but it's tempered by experience. The moral instinct is still there, but it's been tested by real pain. He hasn't lost what makes him him. He's just finally understanding what it costs. And that's what makes this portrayal so powerful. Because it doesn't turn Peter into a perfect hero, it turns him into a complete one. A hero who feels everything. A hero who makes mistakes. A hero who chooses compassion even when it breaks him. And in the end, that's exactly what Spider-Man is supposed to be. On the surface, the multiverse feels like the biggest idea in the film. Infinite realities. Different timelines. Worlds colliding. It sounds massive, complicated, almost overwhelming. But here's the truth. The multiverse isn't the story. It's the tool that allows the story to happen. Because No Way Home doesn't use the multiverse just to go bigger. It uses it to go deeper. Yes, it opens the door to spectacle. Yes, it brings in characters from different universes. Yes, it expands the scale beyond anything Peter has faced before. But more importantly, it creates consequences. It takes one mistake, one emotional decision, and amplifies it into something uncontrollable. What starts as a simple attempt to fix Peter's life becomes a fracture in reality itself. And that's the real narrative purpose of the multiverse here, to show that actions don't just affect your world, they ripple beyond it. But there's another layer to it. The multiverse isn't just about space, it's about identity. Because when different versions of Spider-Man and his world collide, the film starts asking a deeper question. What defines Spider-Man? Is it the suit, the powers, the circumstances, or is it something more fundamental? By bringing multiple versions into the same story, the film explores that idea in a way that a single timeline never could. It shows that no matter the universe, no matter the differences, certain truths remain constant. Loss, responsibility, choice. And suddenly, the multiverse stops being a gimmick and becomes a mirror. A way for Peter to see himself from the outside, to learn from versions of his own future, to understand the weight of the path he's walking. It's not just worlds colliding, it's perspectives colliding. And that's why it works, because instead of confusing the story, it actually clarifies it. Now, that doesn't mean the multiverse is perfect here. There are moments where the rules feel loose, where the logic doesn't fully hold up, where the mechanics are more convenient than consistent. But the film almost dares you to look past that, because emotionally, it lands. Narratively, it serves a purpose, and thematically, it elevates the story beyond a standard superhero conflict. Without the multiverse, this would be a much smaller film, more contained, more straightforward. But with it, the stakes become personal and universal at the same time. Peter isn't just dealing with his own life anymore. He's dealing with the consequences of his choices across realities. And that's what gives the film its scale, not just visually, but emotionally. In the end, the multiverse isn't there to impress you with complexity. It's there to challenge the hero, to force him to confront who he is, who he could become, and what his choices truly mean. And when it's used like that, it stops being a spectacle and becomes storytelling. This is the moment, the one everyone was waiting for, the one surrounded by rumors, leaks, denials, and pure anticipation. But here's the thing. The return of the previous Spider-Man isn't just a surprise. It's the heart of the film, because when they finally appear, something shifts. This stops being just Peter Parker's story and becomes the story of Spider-Man across generations. And that's what makes it powerful. At first, there's excitement, pure, undeniable excitement. Seeing them together on screen is something fans never thought would actually happen. It feels surreal. It feels earned. It feels like history unfolding in real time. But once that initial thrill settles, you realize something deeper is happening. These aren't just alternate versions. They are fully lived lives. Each Spider-Man carries a past. Each one carries loss. Each one carries regret, growth, and experience that the others don't have. And when they come together, they don't compete. They connect. The film uses their presence to do something incredibly smart. It turns them into mirrors for each other. They compare, they question, they learn. They even joke, yes, but beneath that humor is something much more meaningful. Perspective. Because for the first time, Peter isn't alone in what he's going through. He sees versions of himself who have already walked this path, who have made mistakes, who have lost people, who have survived things he's only beginning to understand, and that changes everything. Their presence brings emotional guidance. It brings wisdom. It brings a sense of continuity that goes beyond a single timeline. They show him what Spider-Man becomes when the cost finally hits, and at the same time, they bring something else to the film: closure. For years, those previous Spider-Man stories existed separately. Different tones, different worlds, different journeys. But here, they're acknowledged, respected, given space to matter again. Moments that once felt incomplete now feel resolved. Emotional threads that were left hanging finally find meaning. And that's why this isn't just fan service, it's emotional completion. Of course, there's humor, and it works beautifully. The contrast between them, their different experiences, even the small details about how they operate, all of that adds charm and energy to the film. But the real impact isn't in the jokes, it's in the quiet moments, the conversations, the shared understanding, the way they support Peter when he's at his lowest. Because in those moments, they're not just Spider-Men, they're mentors, equals, survivors. And that's what elevates their inclusion. They don't take over the story, they strengthen it. They don't overshadow Peter, they help define him. By the time the film reaches its emotional peak, their presence feels essential, not because of who they are to the audience, but because of what they mean to the character. They remind him who Spider-Man is supposed to be, and more importantly, they remind us that no matter the universe, no matter the version, Spider-Man is never just one story. It's a legacy. In most superhero movies, villains serve one purpose: to be stopped, defeated, destroyed, removed. But Spider-Man: No Way Home does something very different. It asks a simple but powerful question: what if the villains don't need to be destroyed? What if they need to be saved? And that idea changes everything. Because the antagonists in this film aren't just threats, they're broken people pulled out of their own stories. Each one arrives with history, with trauma, with a fate they were already heading toward. And here's the twist: many of them were brought into this world at the exact moment they were about to die. So suddenly, the conflict isn't just about stopping them. Oh, it's about deciding what they deserve. Do you send them back to their deaths, or do you try to give them a second chance? That's the dilemma at the core of this film, and it's where Peter Parker's character truly stands apart. Because while others see danger, he sees possibility. He refuses to treat them as disposable. He refuses to believe they are beyond saving, even when it's risky, even when it goes against logic, even when it turns everyone against him. He chooses redemption. And that choice transforms the role of the villains completely. They're no longer just obstacles in the story. They become moral tests. Each one represents a different kind of fall, a different kind of corruption, a different version of what happens when power goes wrong. And Peter's mission becomes clear: not to defeat them, but to fix what broke them. That's a bold narrative direction, especially in a blockbuster this big, because it slows things down. It complicates the conflict. It forces the story to deal with ethics instead of just action. And it creates tension not just between hero and villain, but between ideas. This is where Doctor Strange's perspective clashes with Peter's, where logic meets empathy, where efficiency meets compassion, and neither side is entirely wrong. But the film makes it clear where it stands. Because when Peter chooses to help the villains, he's not just trying to save them. He's trying to prove something. That power doesn't give you the right to decide who deserves to die. That being a hero means doing the harder thing, not the easier one. Now, does every villain get equal depth? Not exactly. Some are more developed than others. Some feel more like extensions of the plot than fully explored characters. But the key ones, especially the most iconic, bring real weight to this idea. They feel dangerous, they feel unstable, they feel like people who could have been something else under different circumstances. And that's what makes the redemption angle work. Because it's not guaranteed, it's uncertain, it's risky, and at times it feels like it might completely fall apart. Which is exactly why it matters. Because when redemption is easy, it means nothing. But when it costs something, when it puts the hero in danger, when it leads to consequences, that's when it becomes powerful. And No Way Home doesn't shy away from those consequences. Peter's decision to help the villains doesn't come without a price. In fact, it's the choice that changes everything. By the end of the film, you understand that this wasn't just a different way to handle villains. It was the defining test of who Peter Parker is. Not the strength of his powers, not the scale of his battles, but the strength of his compassion. Because in a world where it would be easier to fight, he chose to heal. And that's what makes this story stand out. The villains aren't just there to be defeated. They're there to be understood. And maybe, just maybe, given another chance. Every great superhero story needs a villain. But every once in a while, you get something more than that. You get a presence, a force. A character that doesn't just oppose the hero, but dominates the screen. And in No Way Home, that character is the Green Goblin. From the moment he enters the story, everything changes. Because this isn't just another villain joining the chaos. This is a character who brings real danger back into the film. While others arrive with spectacle, nostalgia, or even moments of humor, the Green Goblin arrives with something else entirely. Unpredictability. You never feel like you're in control when he's on screen. You never feel safe. You never feel like the situation can be contained. And that's what makes him terrifying. Because he's not just powerful, he's unstable. There's a constant tension in his presence, a sense that at any moment everything could snap. And when it does, it's not clean, it's not heroic, it's not even fair, it's chaos. What makes this even more compelling is the duality of the character. The line between Norman Osborn and the Goblin isn't just blurred, it's constantly shifting. One moment, you see vulnerability, the next, pure malice. And that unpredictability keeps you locked in. You're not just watching a villain, you're watching a mind at war with itself. But when the goblin takes over, he doesn't just become a threat, he becomes the threat. Because unlike other villains who operate with goals or logic, the goblin thrives on destruction, on manipulation, on breaking people, not just physically but emotionally. And that's where he becomes most dangerous. He doesn't just fight Spider-Man, he targets Peter Parker. He understands what makes him vulnerable. He sees the compassion, the hesitation, the moral code, and he uses it against him. He pushes him, provokes him, tries to force him to abandon everything he stands for. And suddenly, the conflict isn't just physical anymore. It's psychological, it's personal. It's about whether Peter will stay true to who he is or be dragged down to the goblin's level. And that's what elevates this villain above the rest. Because the Green Goblin isn't just trying to win, he's trying to corrupt. And in doing so, he creates some of the most intense, emotionally charged moments in the entire film. Scenes where the energy shifts completely, where the tone darkens, where the stakes feel real. Because for all the spectacle, all the multiverse chaos, all the larger-than-life elements, the Green Goblin brings the story back to something raw. Fear, pain, loss. And Willem Dafoe delivers this with absolute control. There's a physicality to the performance, a sharpness, a presence, a way he moves and reacts that makes every scene feel charged. But it's the expression, the voice, the unpredictability that truly sells it. He doesn't just play the villain, he inhabits it. And that's why, in a film packed with characters, cameos, and massive moments, he stands above the rest. Because when the Green Goblin is on screen, you're not thinking about the multiverse. You're not thinking about nostalgia. You're not even thinking about the spectacle. You're thinking one thing, this is real danger. And in a movie this big, that's what makes him unforgettable. At first glance, Doctor Strange feels like a guide, the expert, the authority, the one who understands forces far beyond Peter Parker's level. But as the story unfolds, he becomes something else entirely, a counterpoint. Because Doctor Strange doesn't just move the plot forward, he challenges everything Peter believes. From the very beginning, Strange represents control, precision, order. He deals with threats on a cosmic level, where decisions have to be made quickly, efficiently, and without hesitation. To him, the situation is simple. The multiverse is breaking. The villains don't belong here. They need to be sent back. No debate, no delay. But Peter doesn't see it that way. Where Strange sees a problem, Peter sees people. And that's where the conflict begins. Because this isn't just a disagreement about strategy, it's a clash of ideologies. Strange believes in fixing the system. Peter believes in saving the individual. Strange is focused on stability. Peter is focused on compassion. And both of them are right in their own way. That's what makes their dynamic so compelling. Because for once, the conflict isn't driven by a villain. It's driven by two heroes who fundamentally disagree on what it means to do the right thing. Strange operates with experience. He's seen the consequences of failure on a universal scale. He understands that hesitation can lead to catastrophe. For him, sacrificing a few lives to save reality is a harsh but necessary decision. Peter refuses to accept that. He believes that if there's even a chance to help someone, you take it. Even if it complicates everything. Even if it makes the situation worse before it gets better. And that belief puts him directly in Strange's path. What follows isn't just a physical confrontation, it's a battle of principles. Efficiency versus empathy. Control versus hope. Logic versus morality. And in that conflict, the film forces a question onto the audience. What would you do? Would you make the hard, necessary choice or the compassionate, risky one? Strange, for all his power, represents a world where decisions are made at scale, where individual lives can become secondary to the greater good. Peter represents the opposite, a world where every life matters, no matter how broken, no matter how dangerous, no matter the cost. And that's why their conflict matters so much, because it defines the direction of the entire story. Strange is trying to restore order. Peter is trying to redefine what that order should be, and neither one can fully convince the other. But here's what makes it even more interesting. The film doesn't turn Strange into a villain. He's not wrong, he's just different. He's pragmatic where Peter is idealistic. He's experienced where Peter is still learning. He's willing to make sacrifices that Peter refuses to make. And that tension never fully disappears. Even when the story moves forward, you can feel that divide. Because in the end, this isn't about who wins the argument. It's about what kind of hero Peter chooses to become. Does he follow Strange's path, the path of logic, sacrifice, and control? Or does he stay true to his own instincts, the belief that saving people is always worth the risk? That's the real purpose of Doctor Strange in this story, not just to open the multiverse, but to challenge the hero standing inside it. And in doing so, he forces Peter and the audience to confront a deeper truth. Sometimes, the hardest battles aren't against villains, they're against other ways of thinking. This is a film that looks big, but more importantly, it feels big. Because No Way Home isn't just throwing spectacle at the screen, it's carefully balancing action, visual effects, and storytelling in a way that keeps the experience constantly engaging. From the very first major set piece, you can tell this isn't going to be small scale. The film leans fully into blockbuster territory, shifting environments, large-scale destruction, high-speed movement, and moments where reality itself seems to bend. But what makes it work is that it doesn't lose control, because spectacle without structure becomes noise. And this film understands that. Every action sequence is built with purpose. It's not just about what's happening visually, it's about why it's happening and how it connects back to Peter's journey. The action isn't random, it's motivated. Whether it's chaotic encounters, close-range combat, or massive climactic battles, the film keeps tying those moments back to character stakes. That's what gives the action weight. You're not just watching things explode, you're watching consequences unfold. Visually, the film delivers exactly what audiences expect from a modern Marvel production, and in many moments, it goes even further. The effects are sharp, dynamic, and often overwhelming in scale. Magic sequences twist space in creative ways. The environments feel fluid and unpredictable. The blending of practical movement with CGI creates a sense of constant motion. And even when you know it's all built on green screens and digital layers, it still pulls you in. Because the film uses visual effects not just for scale, but for imagination. It plays with space. It plays with physics. It plays with perspective. And that gives the action a unique identity. But what really stands out is how the film balances different types of action. It's not just one note. You get high-energy, large-scale sequences that feel explosive and cinematic. Tighter, more physical encounters that feel grounded and intense. Moments where the action slows down just enough to let the emotion catch up. That variation is crucial, because it prevents fatigue. In a movie this long, with this much happening, it would be easy to overwhelm the audience. But instead, the film creates a rhythm, pushing forward with spectacle, then pulling back to breathe, then building again towards something bigger. And that's why the runtime doesn't feel as heavy as it could. The film keeps moving, it keeps evolving. It keeps giving you something new to look at, something new to feel. Now, are the visual effects perfect? Not always. There are moments where the digital nature of the film becomes more noticeable. Certain sequences feel less grounded than others. Some environments don't fully convince. But here's the thing. Even when the illusion slips slightly, the impact doesn't. Because the action is still exciting. The stakes are still clear, and the energy never drops. That's what matters. At its best, the film delivers sequences that are not just visually impressive, but emotionally charged. Moments where spectacle and story collide in a way that keeps you fully invested. And by the time the film reaches its final act, it doesn't just feel like a big action movie. It feels like a culmination. Everything, the visuals, the movement, the scale, builds towards something that feels earned, not just assembled. And that's the difference, because anyone can make something look big. But balancing spectacle with meaning? That's what turns visual effects into cinematic experience. And No Way Home gets that right more often than not. In a film this big, this emotional, this intense, humor isn't optional, it's essential, because without it, everything would collapse under its own weight. And No Way Home understands that balance better than most. From the very beginning, the film weaves humor into its DNA, not as a distraction, but as a release valve. A way to keep the audience engaged, to break tension, and to remind you that beneath all the chaos, these are still human characters reacting to impossible situations. And the humor here feels natural. It doesn't rely on forced punchlines or constant one-liners. Instead, it grows out of character, out of awkwardness, out of personality clashes, out of situations that are so absurd, the only response left is laughter. That's where the banter shines. When characters interact, especially those who shouldn't logically be in the same space, the film leans into the contrast. Different personalities, different experiences, different ways of seeing the world. And that creates moments that feel spontaneous rather than scripted. There's a looseness to the dialogue at times, a sense that characters are genuinely reacting, not just delivering lines. And that makes the humor land more effectively. But what really elevates the comedy is timing. The film knows exactly when to let a joke breathe and when to pull back, because this isn't a comedy. It's a story filled with emotional stakes, loss, and consequence. And if the humor overpowered that, it would break the tone. Instead, it complements it. Right when things start to feel too heavy, a lighter moment slips in. Right when the tension peaks, a quick exchange resets the rhythm. And then the film dives back into the drama. That push and pull is what keeps the experience engaging. Now, not every comedic element works equally for everyone. Some characters lean more heavily into comic relief, and for some viewers, that can feel excessive. At times, certain moments may come across as a bit too playful, especially when the story is dealing with serious themes. But even then, the humor rarely derails the film, because it's anchored in character. It doesn't feel like the movie is stopping to be funny. It feels like the characters are being themselves, and that's an important distinction. What also stands out is how the humor isn't limited to just one tone. There's lighthearted, almost awkward humor. There's self-aware humor that plays with expectations. There's subtle, character-driven humor. And there are moments of pure fan-oriented joy that feel celebratory. And when all of that comes together, it creates a film that never feels emotionally one-dimensional. Because even in its darkest moments, it remembers to breathe. It remembers to smile. It remembers that humor is part of what makes these characters relatable in the first place. And that's what makes it effective. The comedy doesn't weaken the story, it humanizes it. It reminds you that behind the masks, the powers, the multiverse chaos, there are still people trying to make sense of everything. And sometimes, the only way to do that is to laugh. For all its spectacle, for all its humor, for all its crowd-pleasing moments, No Way Home is, at its core, a story about loss. And not just any loss. The kind that changes you. The kind that defines you. The kind you don't walk away from the same. Because this is the film where everything finally catches up to Peter Parker. Up until now, he's been the hopeful one, the energetic one, the kid still figuring things out. But here, the story takes that version of him and puts it through something far more serious, something permanent. And when that turning point hits, you feel it. The tone shifts, the energy drops, the story stops being playful and becomes painfully real. This isn't just another obstacle in a superhero journey. This is the moment. The moment where the weight of being Spider-Man finally lands. Because for the first time, Peter isn't just dealing with danger, he's dealing with grief. And the film doesn't rush past it. It lets it sit. It lets it hurt. It lets the silence speak just as loudly as the action ever did. And that's what gives these moments their power. Because they're not just written to move the plot forward, they're written to change the character. Everything that comes after feels different. Peter's choices feel heavier, his reactions feel sharper, his emotional state feels fragile, and at times, dangerously close to breaking. And that's where the film becomes something more than just entertainment. It becomes a test. Because grief doesn't just bring sadness, it brings anger, it brings confusion, it brings the temptation to make choices you can't take back. And the film explores that. It pushes Peter to the edge. It puts him in a position where the line between hero and something darker starts to blur, where the pain could easily turn into something destructive. And in those moments, you see a different side of him. Not the friendly neighborhood hero, not the hopeful kid, but someone who is hurting and doesn't know how to carry it. And that's where the dramatic turning points truly land. Because they're not just big moments, they're defining moments. Moments that force Peter to decide who he is going to be when everything inside him is telling him to break. And what makes this even more powerful is how the film connects that grief to the broader legacy of Spider-Man. Because this isn't new. Every version of Spider-Man has been shaped by loss. But here, it's not just referenced, it's felt. It's experienced in real time. And it ties Peter to something bigger than himself. A pattern, a truth, a responsibility that comes with being this character. And that's why these emotional beats matter so much. They aren't just there to make you feel sad, they're there to transform the story, to shift it from spectacle into something personal. Now, do all of these moments land perfectly for everyone? Not necessarily. Some may feel certain scenes could have gone deeper. Others may feel the balance between emotion and pacing isn't always perfect. But even then, the impact is undeniable. Because when the film commits to its emotional core, it hits, and it stays with you, long after the action ends, long after the credits roll. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just a story about saving the world. It's a story about learning how to live with loss, and still choosing to do what's right. At its core, Spider-Man: No Way Home isn't about the multiverse, it's not about villains, it's not even about spectacle. It's about a question: what does it truly mean to be Spider-Man? And the answer the film gives is heavier than ever before, because this story takes the most iconic idea tied to this character, responsibility, and pushes it further than we've seen in this version of Peter Parker. Responsibility here isn't just about saving people, it's about how you save them. It's about the choices you make when there's no easy answer. Because Peter is faced with a dilemma that defines the entire film. Do you do what's necessary, or do you do what's right? And those two things are not the same. That's where compassion comes in. While others see enemies, Peter sees people. Broken people. Dangerous people, yes, but still people who might have been something else under different circumstances. And he refuses to give up on that idea. Even when it makes things harder, even when it puts him at risk. Even when it leads to consequences he can't control, he still chooses compassion. And that's not weakness, that's conviction, because it would be easier to fight, easier to send them away, easier to end the problem. But Peter chooses the harder path, the path of redemption. And that's where the film becomes something more than just a superhero story, because redemption isn't guaranteed. Not everyone can be saved, not every situation can be fixed, not every choice leads to the outcome you hope for. And the film makes that clear. It doesn't present redemption as simple or clean. It presents it as messy, risky, costly. And that cost is what drives Peter's maturity. Because by the end of the story, he's not the same person. He's still compassionate. He still believes in doing the right thing. But now he understands what that truly demands. He understands that responsibility isn't just about power. It's about sacrifice. It's about choosing to carry pain so others don't have to. It's about doing what's right, even when no one sees it, no one remembers it, and no one thanks you for it. And that's the transformation. This isn't just Peter learning how to be a hero. This is Peter learning what it costs to stay one. And that's why these themes hit so hard. Because they take everything we think we know about Spider-Man and strip it down to its core. Responsibility, compassion, redemption, maturity. Not as ideas, but as choices. And by the time the film ends, you realize something. Being Spider-Man isn't about swinging through the city. It's about standing alone after everything is gone and still choosing to do good. That's the real meaning of The Mask. A story this big can't survive on one character alone, and No Way Home knows that. Because while Peter Parker is the emotional core, it's the people around him that give that story weight. This isn't just a solo journey, it's an ensemble. And every character, whether they're in the spotlight or just on the edges, plays a role in shaping who Peter becomes. Let's start with the closest circle. MJ and Ned aren't just side characters here. They are anchors. They represent Peter's normal life, his connection to something real. And when that normal life starts falling apart, you feel it through them. MJ, in particular, carries more emotional presence this time. She's not just reacting, she's involved. She challenges, supports, questions, and becomes a meaningful part of Peter's emotional world. There's a sense that she's no longer just along for the ride, she matters to the journey. Ned, on the other hand, brings energy, humor, levity. He's the kind of character that keeps the film from becoming too heavy, too serious, too overwhelming. Now, for some viewers, that lighter tone may feel like too much at times, especially when the stakes are high, but his presence still serves a purpose. He reminds us that Peter is still just a kid, with friends. Then there's Aunt May, and her role is foundational. She isn't just a supporting character, she's a moral compass, a grounding force. Someone who represents what Peter should stand for when everything else becomes unclear. Her presence gives the story emotional clarity, because when Peter is lost, she's the one who reminds him who he is. And that influence carries through the entire film, even beyond her physical presence. Then you have characters like Happy, who exist in a slightly different space. He's connected to Peter, but also tied to the larger legacy of the MCU. Through him, you feel that bridge between what Spider-Man was and what he's becoming. And then there's the extended ensemble. Doctor Strange, of course, plays a major role, not just in the plot, but in challenging Peter's worldview. He brings scale, authority, and conflict. The returning Spider-Men bring emotional depth and perspective. The villains bring tension, danger, and thematic complexity. Even smaller appearances, brief but impactful, add texture to the world. And that's what stands out. This film is packed with characters, but it doesn't feel empty. Because the best moments aren't just about who shows up. They're about what those characters mean. Every interaction shapes Peter. Every relationship pushes him forward. Every connection adds something to his journey. Now, does every character get equal focus? No. Some are more developed than others. Some feel underused. Some could have had more space to breathe. That's the natural challenge of a film this crowded. But even with that, the ensemble still works. Because the film understands how to use its characters efficiently. It gives them moments, sometimes small, sometimes powerful, that contribute to the bigger picture. And that picture is clear. Peter Parker doesn't exist in isolation. He is defined by the people around him, by the ones who support him, the ones who challenge him, the ones he tries to protect, and ultimately, the ones he has to let go. That's what makes the ensemble so important. Because in the end, they're not just part of the story, they're the reason it hurts. Let's be honest, this film is packed with fan service. But here's the real question. Is it empty nostalgia or meaningful storytelling? Because No Way Home walks a very fine line. On one side, you have moments clearly designed to make audiences react, the kind that trigger applause, cheers, and instant recognition. On the other side, you have something deeper, because the callbacks in this film aren't just references, they're continuations. They take moments, relationships, and emotional beats from earlier Spider-Man films and give them new meaning in the present. And that's what makes them work. This isn't just about saying, remember this? It's about asking, what does that moment mean now? You see it in the dialogue. Lines that echo the past, but carry a different emotional weight this time. You see it in the character interactions. Reunions that aren't just exciting, they're loaded with history. You see it in specific moments that mirror earlier events, but with a twist, a reversal, a redemption, a second chance. And suddenly, those callbacks stop being surface level. They become emotional payoffs. Because for longtime fans, these aren't just scenes, they're memories, moments they've carried for years. And when the film revisits them, not as copies, but as evolutions, it creates something incredibly satisfying. It feels like unfinished stories are finally being completed. That's why the fan service lands so strongly for many people. It's not separate from the narrative, it's woven into it. The references help define character arcs. They influence decisions. They shape the emotional core of the film. Even the smallest details, subtle nods, visual echoes, dialogue callbacks, contribute to that sense of continuity. It's like the movie is constantly reminding you all of this matters. Now, of course, this approach isn't perfect. There are moments where the fan service feels obvious, moments where it leans a little too heavily into giving the audience exactly what they want. And for some viewers, that can feel like manipulation, like the film is relying on nostalgia instead of earning its impact. That criticism is valid, because yes, this film knows how to push those emotional buttons, but here's the difference. Most of the time, it earns it. Because those moments don't just exist to get a reaction. They exist to move the story forward. They carry consequences, they change characters, they add meaning. And that's what separates good fan service from empty fan service. One just reminds you of the past, the other builds on it. And No Way Home, more often than not, does the second. By the time the film reaches its biggest moments, the callbacks don't feel like references anymore. They feel like resolutions, like the story is finally acknowledging everything that came before and giving it a place in the present. And that's why, for so many people, this film feels special. Because it doesn't treat Spider-Man as one version, it treats him as a legacy, a history, a collection of stories that all lead to this moment. And in doing so, it turns fan service into something more. Not just nostalgia, but closure. This is a long movie, nearly 2.5 hours. And with everything it's trying to do, multiple characters, multiple storylines, emotional arcs, action, multiverse chaos, it should feel heavy. But here's what's surprising. Most of the time, it doesn't. Because No Way Home is built on momentum. From the very start, the film drops you straight into the aftermath of Peter's identity being revealed. There's no slow build-up, no drawn-out setup. It moves quickly, almost urgently, pushing you through the consequences before you even have time to process them. And that pace continues. Event leads to event. Choice leads to consequence. Problem leads to escalation. The structure is constantly moving forward, and for many viewers, that's what makes the runtime feel shorter than it actually is. The film rarely sits still. There's always something happening, emotionally, narratively, or visually. But that speed comes with a trade-off, because the film isn't structured like a quiet, carefully spaced drama. It's structured more like a chain reaction. And then this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. And depending on how you experience it, that can either feel exciting or overwhelming. Now, where the film really succeeds is in its tonal balance. Because it's juggling a lot, comedy, action, drama, nostalgia, tragedy. And switching between those tones isn't easy. One moment, you're laughing at a lighthearted exchange. The next, you're watching something emotionally devastating unfold. That kind of shift can feel jarring in the wrong hands. But here, more often than not, it works. Because the film understands timing. It knows when to let a joke land and when to pull back. It knows when to build tension and when to release it. It knows when to slow down and when to push forward. And that creates a rhythm, a flow that keeps the audience engaged. However, it's not perfect. There are moments, especially in the middle, where the pacing starts to stretch, where the film slows down just enough to feel slightly uneven. Some scenes linger longer than they need to. Some emotional beats don't hit as hard as they could because of how they're positioned. And then there's the issue of bloat. With so many characters and ideas packed into the story, not everything gets equal attention. Some threads feel rushed, while others feel extended. It's the natural consequence of trying to balance so much within a single film. But here's the key. Even when the structure isn't perfectly smooth, the film keeps pulling you forward. Because every time it slows down too much, it gives you something to re-engage. A reveal, an emotional moment, a piece of action, a character interaction that matters. And that's what keeps the pacing from collapsing. It may not be perfectly balanced, but it's consistently engaging. By the time you reach the final act, the structure tightens. Everything starts to converge. The story becomes more focused, more emotional, more direct. And that's where the pacing truly pays off. Because all the buildup, all the chaos, all the shifting tones, all the moving pieces finally lead to something that feels cohesive. A conclusion that brings everything together and leaves you with a sense that the journey, despite its imperfections, was worth it. Because in the end, pacing isn't just about speed, it's about how a film makes you feel over time. And No Way Home, for the most part, keeps you invested every step of the way. This is a story that had no right to work this well. Think about what it's trying to do. Multiple timelines, legacy characters, returning villains, a multiverse concept, a trilogy conclusion, and a character arc that has to land emotionally. On paper, that's chaos. But somehow, No Way Home holds it together. And that comes down to the writing. At its best, the script is ambitious and controlled at the same time. It takes a massive, almost overwhelming concept and finds a way to anchor it around something simple, Peter Parker's choices. That's the key. Because no matter how big the story gets, it always comes back to him. Every major event is tied to something he does. Every turning point is driven by his decisions. Every consequence traces back to his intent. And that's what gives the narrative cohesion. The multiverse isn't random. The villains aren't random. The conflict isn't random. It's all connected. All of it stems from one central idea, a good intention gone wrong. That's strong storytelling, because it gives the film a clear through line, even when the plot becomes complex. Now, structurally, the film does something interesting. It doesn't build slowly toward one central conflict. It layers conflicts on top of each other. First, it's Peter versus the consequences of his identity reveal. Then, it becomes Peter versus the multiverse problem. Then it evolves into Peter versus the moral dilemma of what to do with the villains. And finally, it becomes Peter versus himself. Each layer adds pressure. Each layer raises the stakes. and by the time you reach the final act, everything is colliding at once. That's where the writing shines. Because despite all those moving parts, the film rarely feels directionless. It always knows what it's building toward. Now, that doesn't mean it's flawless. There are definitely cracks. Some plot mechanics don't fully hold up under scrutiny. The rules of the multiverse feel flexible when they need to be. Certain explanations don't quite match how things actually play out, and you can feel that. There are moments where the story is clearly prioritizing emotion over logic, where it asks you to go along with it rather than question it. For some viewers, that's completely fine. For others, it becomes a distraction. Because yes, there are inconsistencies, there are conveniences, there are decisions that feel like they exist to push the plot forward rather than emerge naturally. But here's the important part. Even when the logic wavers, the emotional through line stays intact. And that's what keeps the narrative from falling apart. Because at its core, the story isn't about perfectly explained mechanics. It's about cause and consequence. It's about a character making a choice and living with what that choice creates. That's what holds everything together. The film also does a strong job of managing its ensemble. With so many characters involved, it could easily have become messy, but the writing finds ways to give key figures purpose. Not everyone gets equal depth, but most characters contribute to the central narrative in some meaningful way. They're not just there to fill space. They're part of the puzzle. And when all those pieces come together, the film feels surprisingly cohesive. Not perfect, but cohesive. Because in the end, No Way Home doesn't succeed by being airtight. It succeeds by being focused. Focused on its character. Focused on its themes. Focused on delivering a story that, despite its scale, still feels connected. And that's what makes the writing work. It turns something that could have been chaotic into something that feels like it was always meant to lead here. Managing one Spider-Man is hard enough. This film? It's juggling multiple Spider-Men, multiple villains, multiple timelines, and a decade-spanning legacy. And somehow, it doesn't fall apart. That's where the direction really shows its strength. Because No Way Home isn't just a big movie, it's a complicated movie. There are so many moving pieces here that, in the wrong hands, this could have easily turned into chaos. Too many characters, too many storylines, too many expectations. But instead, it feels controlled. And that control comes from how the film handles its ensemble. The first thing it gets right is focus. Even with all these characters on screen, the film never forgets who the story belongs to. This is still Peter Parker's journey. Everyone else, no matter how iconic, no matter how exciting, exists to support, challenge, or shape that journey. That's crucial, because without that anchor, the film would drift into being nothing more than a collection of cameos. Instead, every major character has a function. The returning Spider-Men bring perspective and emotional grounding. The villains bring conflict and thematic weight. Doctor Strange brings structure and opposition. The supporting cast reinforces the personal stakes. It's not random, it's orchestrated. And that's what good direction does. It turns a crowd into a system. The second thing the film does well is distribution of moments. In a movie like this, the risk is obvious. Some characters get too much attention, others get lost. But here, the film makes an effort to give each key figure at least one moment to stand out. Whether it's through action, dialogue, emotional beats, or interaction with others, most of the major players are given something meaningful to contribute. Not everyone gets equal depth, that's inevitable, but very few feel completely wasted, and that balance is not easy to achieve, especially when dealing with characters that audiences already have strong attachments to. Which brings us to the third strength, respect for legacy. This film isn't just introducing characters, it's reintroducing them. And the direction understands that these aren't blank slates. These are characters with history, with emotional weight, with expectations attached to them. So instead of reshaping them to fit the story, the film adapts the story to fit them. Their personalities remain intact. Their dynamics feel familiar. Their presence feels authentic. And that's what allows the ensemble to feel cohesive rather than forced. Now, of course, there are limitations. With so many characters, some inevitably receive less attention. Some arcs feel lighter than others. Some interactions could have been explored more deeply. There are moments where you can feel the film stretching to accommodate everything. But even then, it rarely feels messy. Because the direction maintains clarity, you always understand where you are, who matters in that moment, what the scene is trying to achieve. And that clarity is what keeps the film from collapsing under its own weight. Another key aspect is how the direction handles tone across the ensemble. Different characters bring different energies. Some are serious, some are comedic, some are emotional, some are chaotic. And blending all of that into one consistent experience is incredibly difficult. But the film manages it. It allows characters to be themselves, while still fitting into the overall tone of the story. No one feels completely out of place, and that's what makes the ensemble feel unified. By the time the film reaches its final act, all those moving pieces come together, not as separate elements, but as a single, coordinated force, and that's where the direction truly succeeds, because it turns what could have been a crowded, unfocused spectacle into something that feels intentional, structured, balanced, and, most importantly, driven by purpose. In the end, handling a legacy-driven ensemble isn't just about putting characters on screen, it's about making them matter. And No Way Home, despite its scale, its ambition, and its complexity, manages to do exactly that. After all the chaos, after the multiverse fractures, after the battles, the reunions, the emotional highs and devastating lows, No Way Home does something unexpected. It goes quiet. Because the ending of this film isn't about victory, it's about loss and what comes after it. For a movie this massive, this loud, this packed with spectacle, the final moments feel almost stripped down, focused, intimate, personal, and that's exactly why they work. Because everything Peter has gone through leads to one final choice, a choice that defines him, not as a superhero, but as a person. He realizes that the only way to fix what's broken, the only way to protect everyone, is to let go of everything that ties him to them, his friends, his relationships, his identity, all of it, gone. And the film doesn't rush past that. It lingers. It lets you sit with the weight of what that means. Because this isn't a temporary sacrifice. This is a reset. The world moves on, but Peter doesn't. He remembers everything, and no one remembers him. That's the cost. And that's what makes this ending so powerful. Because it redefines what it means to be Spider-Man. It's no longer about being recognized. It's no longer about being supported. It's no longer about having a safety net. It's about standing alone and still choosing to do good. That's the transformation. By the time we reach those final scenes, Peter walking through a world that has forgotten him, reconnecting without revealing himself, choosing silence over comfort. You realize this is no longer the same character we started with. This is someone who has grown. Someone who understands responsibility on a completely different level. And then comes the final image. Peter, in a new suit, moving through New York, back where it all began. But this time, he's truly on his own. No mentors, no recognition, no one waiting for him at home, just the city. And the responsibility he chose. And that's where the closure hits. Because on one hand, this feels like an ending. A complete arc, a full circle, a story that has reached its emotional conclusion. But at the same time, it feels like a beginning. A reset to the core of Spider-Man. The friendly neighborhood hero, the anonymous protector, the lone figure doing what's right even when no one knows. And that duality is what makes the ending so effective. It closes the trilogy while opening the door to something new. It gives you resolution but leaves you with possibility. And most importantly, it leaves you with a feeling, not excitement, not spectacle, but something quieter, something deeper, a sense that Peter Parker has finally become the Spider-Man he was always meant to be. Not because he won, but because he chose to sacrifice everything and keep going anyway. This isn't just another sequel, this is a turning point. Because No Way Home doesn't just continue a story, it redefines what that story means within the larger franchise. Think about where this version of Spider-Man started. Introduced in someone else's film, guided by mentors, supported by technology, connections, and a larger universe around him. He was never truly alone, and for an entire trilogy, that idea followed him, until now. Because this film doesn't just wrap things up, it pays everything off. Every criticism, every question, every expectation about who this Spider-Man is supposed to be. It answers all of it, by taking everything away. That's the boldest move this franchise could have made. Because instead of ending on a high note of victory, it ends on transformation. This isn't just the conclusion of a trilogy, it's the completion of an origin story that took 3 films to fully realize. Only now, Peter Parker becomes the version people always expected: independent, grounded, defined by responsibility rather than support. And that's why this film feels so significant. Because it doesn't just close a chapter, it reshapes the entire identity of the character moving forward. At the same time, it does something even bigger. It connects multiple eras of Spider-Man storytelling into one unified moment. Different actors, different timelines, different interpretations, all brought together in a way that feels intentional, not random, not forced, but like a culmination, a celebration of everything the character has been on screen. And that kind of payoff, that kind of scale, is rare, especially in a long-running franchise, because usually, the more films you have, the harder it becomes to make something feel fresh. But here, the film uses its history as a strength. It leans into it, builds on it, and turns it into something that feels like both an ending and an evolution. Now, of course, there's the question everyone asks after a film like this: where does it go from here? And the answer is wide open. Because by resetting Peter's world, the film creates endless possibilities: a smaller, more grounded story, a return to basics, a different tone, a different kind of conflict, or even something bigger, something that expands further into the multiverse idea it introduced. The film doesn't lock itself into one direction, it frees itself. And that's what makes the future exciting. Because for the first time in this trilogy, it feels like anything is possible. At the same time, there's a sense of closure that can't be ignored. If this were the final chapter, it would still feel complete, because the arc has been fulfilled. The journey has meaning, the character has changed, and that balance between finality and possibility is incredibly hard to achieve. But No Way Home does it. It gives longtime fans a payoff. It gives the trilogy a satisfying conclusion, and it sets the stage for whatever comes next, without making it feel like it needs to continue. And that's the real achievement. Because in the end, this film isn't just important because of what it does in the moment. It's important because of what it unlocks, for the character, for the franchise, and for the future of Spider-Man on screen. A conclusion that feels like a beginning. This wasn't just a movie release, it was a moment, because No Way Home didn't just arrive in theaters, it took them over. At a time when cinema was struggling to bring audiences back, when people were hesitant, uncertain, and disconnected from the theatrical experience, this film changed that. It pulled people out of their homes, it filled seats, it brought energy back into theaters, and not quietly, loudly. Because the audience reaction to this film wasn't normal, it was explosive. Moments didn't just land, they erupted. Cheers, gasps, applause, the kind of reactions you don't just hear, you feel. And for many people, that became part of the experience itself. Because watching No Way Home wasn't just about the story on screen, it was about being in a room full of people reacting to it together. And that's something modern blockbusters don't always achieve anymore. But this one did. In fact, for a lot of viewers, it was the first time in years they felt that kind of collective excitement in a cinema. That sense that something bigger was happening, something shared. And that emotional response translated directly into its impact. Because this film didn't just perform well, it dominated. It crossed major box office milestones. It broke records. It became one of the biggest films of its time, especially in a period where the industry needed something exactly like this. It wasn't just successful. It was event-level successful. And beyond the numbers, it took over conversation. Social media exploded. Spoilers became a global concern. Fans actively tried to protect the experience for others. That alone tells you how significant it was. Because people didn't just want to watch this movie, they wanted to preserve it. They wanted others to feel what they felt. And that speaks to its cultural footprint. This wasn't just another entry in a long-running franchise. It became a reference point. A moment people talked about. A moment people compared other films to. A moment that reminded audiences what blockbuster cinema can feel like when everything clicks. Now, of course, not everyone had the same reaction. Some viewers saw the hype and felt it was exaggerated. Others enjoyed the film but didn't see it as groundbreaking. And that's natural. A film this big, this talked about, will always divide opinion. But even among those mixed reactions, one thing remains consistent. People felt something, whether it was excitement, nostalgia, frustration, or pure enjoyment. The film left an impression. And that's what defines cultural impact, not just how many people watch something, but how strongly they react to it. Because in the end, No Way Home didn't just succeed financially, It succeeded emotionally. It brought audiences together. It created shared experiences. It reignited the idea of what a theatrical event can be. And for a film industry that needed that spark, that might be its biggest achievement of all. For all its highs, No Way Home isn't flawless, and honestly, it was never going to be. Because a film this ambitious, this packed, this emotionally loaded is bound to have cracks. The real question is, how much do those cracks matter? Let's start with the most obvious one. Nostalgia dependence. There's no denying it. This film leans heavily on what came before. Familiar faces, recognizable moments, emotional callbacks designed to hit instantly. And for many viewers, that's exactly what makes the film special. But for others, it raises a concern. Is the film standing on its own? Or is it relying on past films to carry its impact? There are moments where it feels like the movie is very aware of the audience, where scenes are constructed not just for the story, but for the reaction, the applause, the recognition, the emotional surge tied to memory rather than narrative. And when that balance tips too far, it can feel less like storytelling and more like orchestration. Now, closely tied to that is the issue of exposition. This is a complex story. Multiverse rules, character histories, interconnected timelines. And the film has to explain enough of that to keep things coherent. But sometimes it explains too much. Dialogue becomes functional. Scenes exist to clarify rather than develop. Characters speak in ways that feel more like information delivery than natural interaction. And that can slow things down. Which brings us to bloat. This is a packed film. And while that scale is part of its appeal, it also creates a problem. There are simply too many elements competing for space. Some scenes stretch longer than necessary. Some ideas feel overextended. And at times, the film feels like it's carrying more than it can comfortably hold. You can feel that weight, especially in the middle sections, moments where the pacing dips, where the narrative starts to feel slightly overloaded. And when you combine that with the next issue, underserved characters, the imbalance becomes more noticeable. Because with so many characters involved, not everyone gets equal attention. Some are given strong, defining moments. Others feel like they're just present. There are characters who could have had deeper arcs, more meaningful contributions, more time to breathe. Instead, they exist on the edges, functional but not fully realized. And in a film built on legacy and emotional connection, that absence can stand out. Then there's the most debated aspect, logic. Or, more specifically, the lack of consistency in it. The rules of the multiverse shift when needed. Certain plot developments feel convenient, some character decisions raise questions, and, yes, if you look closely, there are holes. Moments where the internal logic doesn't quite align. Moments where the story asks you to accept something without fully justifying it. For some viewers, that's a deal breaker. For others, it's part of the genre. Because this is a world built on magic, science fiction, and comic book logic. But even within that framework, there are times where the film feels like it's bending its own rules to reach a desired outcome. And that's noticeable. Now, here's the important part. Do these issues ruin the film? No, but they do shape how you experience it. If you're someone who values tight plotting, consistent logic, and perfectly balanced storytelling, these flaws will stand out. If you're someone who prioritizes emotion, spectacle, and character-driven moments, you might overlook them entirely. Because ultimately, No Way Home is a film that leans into feeling over precision. It chooses emotional impact over airtight logic, momentum over restraint, connection over perfection, and that's both its strength and its weakness. Because the same elements that make it powerful for some viewers are the same ones that make it frustrating for others. And that's what makes this film so interesting, not just because of what it does right, but because of where it falls short. Because in those imperfections, you can see just how much it was trying to achieve. This is where the conversation gets interesting. Because No Way Home isn't just a film people watched, it's a film people argue about. On one side, you have those who see it as something special. A powerful, emotional, crowd-shaking experience. The kind of movie that reminds you why you go to the cinema in the first place. And on the other side, you have those who see the cracks, the conveniences, the reliance on nostalgia, the uneven writing, the moments where spectacle outweighs substance. And here's the truth. Both sides are right, because this film lives in that exact tension. It's an emotional crowd pleaser and an imperfect blockbuster. At the same time, for many viewers, the emotional experience overrides everything else. They remember the reactions, the surprises, the moments that hit them, not logically, but viscerally. The cheers, the silence, the weight of certain scenes, and for those viewers, that's enough, more than enough, because cinema, at its core, is about feeling something. And this film delivers that in a way few others do. But then there's the other perspective, the one that steps back, that looks beyond the immediate emotional impact and starts asking questions. Does the story fully hold together? Are all the characters properly developed? Does the film rely too heavily on what came before? And when you look at it from that angle, the imperfections become clearer. The structure feels uneven in places. Some ideas feel underdeveloped. Some moments feel engineered rather than organic. And for those viewers, the emotional highs don't completely erase those issues, so the experience becomes more mixed, enjoyable but flawed, impressive but not exceptional. And that's why the response to this film is so divided, because it depends entirely on what you value more, the feeling or the framework. If you prioritize emotional payoff, shared experience, and cinematic spectacle, this film is a triumph. If you prioritize narrative precision, tight writing, and internal consistency, it's a film with noticeable shortcomings. And what makes No Way Home fascinating is that it doesn't fully commit to one or the other. It tries to be both. A massive, crowd-pleasing event, and a meaningful, character-driven story. And while it succeeds in many ways, that balancing act is where the division comes from. Because for some, it pulls it off. For others, it doesn't quite get there. But regardless of where you stand, there's one thing that's hard to deny. This film made people feel something. And not just individually, collectively. It created reactions, discussions, debates. It stayed in people's minds long after the credits rolled, and maybe that's the real takeaway. Not whether it's perfect, not whether it's flawed, but the fact that it sparked this kind of response at all. Because in the end, a film that divides people this strongly is usually doing something worth talking about.